Well, I think we're going to get started. Thank you, everyone, for coming out. It's a beautiful afternoon. There are many walks to be taken instead of being in here, but I'm so pleased that you're all here. I'm Cecily Marcus. I'm the curator of the Givens Collection of African American Literature, the Performing Arts Archives, and the Upper Midwest Literary Archives, and also the director and principal investigator for Umbra Search African American History. And this event today is part of the celebration and culmination of Umbra Search's public launch that's been happening throughout 2017. Before I introduce our panelists and say a little bit about why we've created a conversation around archives in African American theater, I just wanted to thank everybody who has helped put this together, the communications team who's live streaming today, so if anyone has a problem with that, let us know, or be aware that we are live streaming on YouTube right now. So hello to everybody who's watching on YouTube. Also to all of the facilities and custodial staff and everybody who makes this room available to us. We're also supported by the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation for this event. So I'm just going to say a little bit about what Umbra Search African American History is. We have a number of its advisory council members here today, which is very, very gratifying. This is an effort that's come out of the Givens Collection over the past couple of years. It came, publicly launched in January of 2017. It's an effort to make African American history materials more accessible. We're doing that in a variety of ways. Probably the principal one is at umbrasearch.org. It's a freely available search engine of a national search engine of African American history materials, archival documents from all over the country. Right now, about 724,000 materials from over 1,000 different archives, museums, libraries. This is a search tool that opens doors to the perspectives that we don't see in Wikipedia, that we don't see in our history books, that we may not have ever heard of at all. A great tool for students, for educators, for artists, for teachers, and for everybody who's interested in American history. We're also doing it through digitization. We've been looking at our own materials here at the University of Minnesota Libraries and discovering the ways that we have collected and described our own African American history materials, which reside across our collections, not just the Givens Collection of African American Literature. So we're digitizing another 500,000 materials from every single collecting unit in Archives and Special Collections, from the Tretter GLBT Studies collection to immigration history to social welfare and on. And we're also doing it through events, bringing people together to talk about African American history, to talk about the relationship between art and archives, to really showcase the work that archivists and curators and librarians are doing all over the country. But now we're at home, and so this conversation on African American history and theater and archives is very special to me. We have an esteemed, fabulous panel. I can't wait to get to them. So. I'll do my introductions relatively quickly. Each of our three speakers today work in various ways with the question of archives, what is in an archive, what is not in an archive, how we animate, activate, bring to life, take the archive out of the library in various ways, whose stories we're telling and who's telling them. Our first speaker, who's coming from the University of Georgia via the University of Buffalo, is Dr. Amma Ghartey-Tagoe Kootin. She creates artistic works based on archival research, and she writes about late 19th century Black performance. Bridging the worlds of academia and arts and entertainment, she's a university professor who's also worked with the National Endowment for the Humanities, National History Day Incorporated, A&E Networks, the History Channel, and many others. Dr. Ghartey-Tagoe Kootin is currently a visiting professor in the arts and the Creative Arts Initiative Artist in Residence program at the University of Buffalo, where with her creative team, she is in the final stages of the development of At Buffalo, a new musical about race and American identity based on the archives that have been left over from the 1901 World's Fair in Buffalo. And if you want to hear more about that, please come to Dr. Ghartey-Tagoe Kootin's performative lecture tomorrow night at 7 o'clock, Kaufman Theater, free and open to the public. Dr. Ghartey-Tagoe Kootin holds an AB from the Afro-American Studies from Harvard University and an MA PhD in Performance Study from NYU's Tisch School of the Arts. We're also joined by Talvin Wilks. He's a playwright, director, dramaturg. His plays include Todd the Boy, Todd the Trial of Uncle S&M, Bread of Heaven, An American Triptych, Jimmy and Lorraine, and As I Remember It with Carmen de Lavajade. De Lavalade. That's a fun word to say. Directorial projects include many things right here in town, as well as other world and regional premieres. They include The Ballad of Emmett Till by Ifa Baeza from Penumbra Theater Company, The Owl Answers by Adrian Kennedy, also at Penumbra, and The Peculiar Patriot by Liza Jessie Peterson, National Black Theater. He's working on a book called A Testament, 40 Years of Black Theater History in the Making, 1964 to 2004, and is currently a visiting professor in the Theater Arts and Dance Department here at the University of Minnesota. And then our facilitator, who will also be one of our conversationalists today, is Dr. Alexis Pauline Gumm. She is the first Black woman to hold the Winton Chair for the liberal arts here at the University of Minnesota for this year and next year. Very glad to have you here. Dr. Gumbs is the author of the forthcoming book, which I can't wait to read, M. Archive, After the End of the World, coming out from Duke. The acclaimed Spill, Scenes of Black Feminist Fugitivity, from 2016, also from Duke, and the editor of Revolutionary Mothering, Love on the Front Lines. With her partner, Sangadore, who's currently an artist in residence here and at the University of Wisconsin, Lawrence, is that correct? Lawrence University, excuse me, thank you. They both are the co-founders of Mobile Homecoming, an experiential archive project amplifying generations of queer Black brilliance. Dr. Gumbs is an avid archive user, as are all of our panelists. She was the first researcher to work with the Audre Lorde papers at Spelman, the June Jordan papers at Harvard, and the Lucille Clifton papers at Emory. And she just got back from looking at the Toni Morrison papers at Princeton, which maybe you can talk a little bit about. So thank you. I invite all of you to please take a seat up front. We're an intimate audience. Please move around so you can see, take some snacks, have some coffee, and enjoy. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to stand here for a moment. Oh, we're going to have such a great time today. Thank y'all for being here. So I sent my co-panelists an excerpt from M Archive, After the End of the World, and I'm going to share it with you all because we just have some time travelers in the space, and we are at a really exciting moment in relationship to the archive. And this is maybe some people looking back on this moment from a different archival moment in the future. It started as an old April Fool's joke that none of us are old enough to have witnessed. There was a kingdom called Google. Kingdom Google bought the planet by managing the information and helping no one have to remember anything anymore. And the empire, called Google, managed most of the information that people sent digitally to each other through machines. Are you following me? Yes, it was like telepathy, but at that point they needed these machines to access their own telepathy. That's what a sad state, meaning planetary moment, it was. Anyway, the vast majority of the communication was digital before it became telepathic. The major change our ancestors experienced was the change from paper to digital. Is everything okay? Okay. Was the change from paper to digital, which was as unimaginable and overwhelming to them in their time as the move to psycho-spiritual interpersonal storage is to us at this time. Almost every human on the planet had or wanted access to a digital device. It was how they externalized their thinking. So what was the joke? I'm getting to it. One day, on April Fool's, it's a fertility day, they celebrated because they knew without saying that laughter and humiliation led to more heterosexual shame sex. One day, on April Fool's, the empire called Google decided to pretend that they were going to start a new service called Paper, where they would materialize the digital communications flying through their zone of influence, which was planetary and total as far as they knew, and send them through the Postal Service, previous rulers of the Empire of Information. It functioned very well as a joke, and it both reminded the subjects how much they loved the speed and lightness of digital communication, and provided a kick in the teeth to the actual postal service, which for some reason still existed, but was at that time going bankrupt. You don't know the historical context, so the joke isn't funny, but the joke is not the point. I'm telling you the story of the baskets, not the story of the joke. The joke was just the accidental spark. Late capitalism, the whole thing, was a bad, clever joke with a cruel duration. And we have reclaimed our laughter for better, more beautiful purposes by now, I hope. I need you to know that the empire called Google and its other digital allies would never have actually done this paper thing they were joking about doing. It was a joke, not a threat, though the joke of capitalism threatened everything that it did not outright destroy. The digital empire depended on the interconnective intuition we already had. But the development of intuition was also a threat. What could make digital products obsolete faster than a telepathic market? In fact, they were engaging all of their workers in the practice of imagining more and more ways to make their own digital services less and less intuitive. By training the people out of intuition and into internalized dependence on digitally externalized, invisible connection, they sought to make their influence indispensable and eternal. We know how that went. But anyway, one of our ancestors, who it turns out was also a descendant of the legendary stagecoach Mary, was inspired by the joke. She saw it as a threat, in a way that was exactly opposite of the intention of the joke and the general response to it. This person, let's call her Mary, felt called and compelled to make the joke real. It was the only way to unyoke the joke. What if, she said, every digital communication flying through wireless wires were to have a material counterpart receivable through the obsolete mail service or hand-to-hand through the redistribution of found objects? Mary especially loved to use popsicle sticks, maybe because of their saliva residual. And yes, she really talked like that. On pieces of used paper, discarded clothes, trash of all kinds, Mary started making a tangible and dirty archive of the clean digital world. Well, Google had zillions, and Mary was only Mary, so she had to get help. She had to induct people into her practice, but it was actually not that hard. There were many people who craved a return to paper, but who had been ashamed to admit it in front of the few remaining trees. Mary's reminder that the most abundant resource of the Google generation was still trash, often in the form of boxes shipped by the almighty ally, Amazon, changed everything. And they got on board, and they brought down the messages from the cloud into the crowd in rather disruptive and beautiful ways, I must say. Some of the most talented hackers joined Mary, and so even government secrets and encrypted lab experiments were floating around on sweetly placed candy wrappers and the like. So that is how the tradition was born that ultimately led to this thing we are doing now. This is how the story of the apocalypse ultimately got in our hands. Okay, that's lesson one. So we're gonna do an activity because we are in the archive, literally, geographically, but we're always in the archive. So we wanted to do a partner activity, and this is how it works. You get to share with somebody sitting near you an artifact that you have with you, like something that you have with you, maybe something you're wearing, tattoo you have, something in your wallet, something in your purse, that connects you to somebody who you love who is not in this room. And so we're doing this as our archival dedication. Like, you get to dedicate your listening and your participation in this conversation to someone who's not physically in this room, but who you in fact brought with you through the artifacts that you're wearing. So we can model. Y'all ready to model? Okay, we can model the type of thing you might share with your partner. And this is also our way of bringing ourselves into the room powerfully and bringing our folks. So I am wearing, and I actually am always wearing, the jewelry of my grandmother and her sisters. So my grandmother Lydia, her sisters Elsie and Lorraine. And I'll just say that my aunt Elsie said to me on the phone after my first breakup when I was in college, I don't even know how she heard about this breakup. she said, "My dear, you will have many great loves." And I think about that and I hear her saying that, not because like every love has been better than that particular love was at that particular age, but also because as somebody who's an archivist and an artist and a scholar and a sister and a lover and a troublemaker and a ceremonial priestess, I do have many great loves in my life in many ways. So I'm dedicating my presence here to Aunt Elsie.
Hello, everyone. It's a joy to see you, and you talk back because I live in Atlanta, so I love hearing an audience that will say hello back. So what I have brought is already in my name. My name is Nanama Yamwa Ghartey-Tagoe Kootin. As part of that name, I have a photograph currently archived on Snapfinish. But the hard copy is in Douglasville, Georgia, on the shelves of my parents' home, who are watching via YouTube now. Hi, Mom, hi, Dad. But the photograph is from April 26, 1935, Nagona Abaddon, in present-day Ghana, West Africa. My name, every part of my name, tells you exactly where I'm from, whom I'm from. Nana signals that I'm named after royalty. Amma means girl born on Saturday. For the Akan groups of people, including the Fanti, the Ashanti, etc. Yamwa is the name of this woman seated in the center, who actually was also Amma Yamwa. She's my father's grandmother, so my great-grandmother. I'm named after her. Now, when the British came, we got added a last name. So the Ghartey-Tagoe is my maiden name, but the Ghartey tells you that I'm from the Hutu people of present-day Winneba. Tagoe is from the Gam people, and then Kootin is my married name. My husband who's from Obuasi in Ghana, and that's the Ashanti people. Each part of my name is an archive connected directly to this woman in the center, Amma Yamwa, who was royalty. And I keep telling my parents that against my will, they came to the North America, making me abdicate my throne as Nanama Yamwa II.
Okay, reclaim your throne.
I'm telling you. So that's the archive. That's in it right here.
Beautiful.
Well, we were tipped to this engagement, this idea, and I happen to have a very special piece of clothing hanging in my office. It was a gift to me from Jonathan McCrory at the National Black Theater, where I just opened a play that opened their season, The Peculiar Patriot. And I'm going to stand so you can see it, and it says, and at the bottom, it says National Black Theater, established 1968 Harlem, and it's a tribute to Dr. Barbara Antier, the founder of National Black Theater. So I am very honored to bring that legend and that legacy and that honor with me, and so I am wearing my archive.
Yes, 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 yes. Okay, so your turn. You get to turn to someone sitting near you and let them know. I mean, I let them know in advance and I didn't let you know. But you already have something with you that's connected to somebody else. So please share part of your archive. With someone sitting near you. You too on live stream. Share your archive in the comments or with somebody with you.
So this was, so in a way, I was going to ask you that overlap, didn't we? Okay. I'll move it a little closer.
This is the ring I used to do.
Take it out if you want to. So no, this is very special. I'm honored. Thank you.
So take about 1 more minute sharing your archive. Like in 2004, she asked her that. So she has this list dance to one every morning. I push play random, and I just, dance to one every morning. It's part of my habitation. Hey, Lord, no, we understand you still have work to do, and you still have willing bodies here who are listening. So, it's an important part of me.
Well, it's an important part, the idea of saying, activating.
Find out. I'm gonna do this. Okay, so who would like to? We can have about 2 people to share your archive or your artifact with the whole group. Anybody excited to share a piece of your archive? Y'all just gonna sit here and eat popcorn like you watching on live stream? Yay!
Thank you. Hi, everybody. My name's Zoe, and I have these 2 rings. They're both silver, and one of them, they're both from my mom, Julie, and one of them has some beautiful gemstones and crystals and quartz, and it's something that reminds me that she always had those things in our house, and I didn't really think about their attributes or like energy or any of that other kind of stuff until I got older, but just remembering how she kind of taught us little things about them, and it reminds me of her. And the other ring that I have is from her that she found in like a church basement sale. She loves those, and she's always going to them and finding little strange things and sending them to me. And she always talks about like what a treasure trove Buffalo is. I'm from Buffalo, New York. Yay! Just it reminds me of what great gems in people there are in Buffalo, people who have just done incredible things in history, but there's not a lot, it's not talked about a lot, and so it's almost like there's like a beach and you find this little like special thing, but only when you go and look for it. So anyways, I feel like I'm bringing my mom and just people in Buffalo. So. Yeah, thank you.
Does one more person want to share a piece of their archive? Yeah.
I also have a ring. My mother died 2 years ago from breast cancer, and so I have the smallest fingers in my family, so I was given her ring, and these are the rings I've always loved to play with as a child. And so the wedding band is from my father, and the engagement ring is the one that he gave her. And it brings back the stories of Rondo, because my mother grew up on Rondo, and my father is from the north side. And it was like bringing those 2 energies together that usually don't come together. But Rondo is no longer with us, and so I remember Rondo and also my mother.
So we're just going to continue talking about the intersection, which you all have made very obvious to each other and to us, of archives and personal relationships, right? And so I'm thinking of, shout out to my archivist soulmate. I have an archivist soulmate, because when people collect exactly the things that you need for your life, you're like, we go together, yes. So Stephen Fullwood is my archivist soulmate, and I'm so grateful for the work that he's done at the Schomburg and all the work that he will continue to do. But I was thinking about the 2 of you. Amma, I was thinking, you were talking a little bit last night about how archival research led you to Joan Maynard, who became chosen godmother and chosen goddaughter, and Talvin. The work that you're doing with Carmen de la Valade is incredible that you've been able to make that public. And she's also in your Facebook profile picture, I've noticed. So those might be places to start, or any other place that you want to go in terms of the archive and your personal relationships, how those things intersect for you.
Great. That is such a great way to begin, right? Because archives are about provenance as well. So how the archive came to be. So the story of how did we come to the archive. I love beginning there. And it wasn't until last night that I really articulated that for myself over dinner, because I work much faster and better over food. So just feed me and I'll talk about anything. In part, why you see me today doing what I'm doing is not only a part of a divine intervention kind of story, but it directly goes to archival material. When I found myself over 20 years ago, a high school student in Manhattan, the Little Apple, Kansas, taking a U.S. history course in which they were doing National History Day projects. How many of you have heard of National History Day? Yeah, so like our librarian and archivist friends, you know that really well. It's this great program for 6th through 12th grade students to choose a historical topic. They do like doctoral level research under an annual theme. That year's theme was taking a stand in history. And then they choose one of 4 ways to present their research. Now 5 ways, but back then it was you could write a paper, you could do a museum exhibit, you could do a documentary or performance. And I always loved performance. I was like, great, I want to do a performance. So I went home and I asked my mother, I said, this theme is taking a stand in history. I need to find a story to tell. And she said, have you heard of the story of Joseph Cinque and the Amistad incident? And I was like, no. And this was before Spielberg's film. So my mother went down to our family basement, much like the church basement, right? And she came back up with what I called an old historical comic book called The Golden Legacy, illustrated comic books that told stories from African American history like Matthew Henson, Harriet Tubman. And the last story that my parents had bound together was the story of Joseph Cinque. And I read it and I was like, how come I don't know this story of an African man from Mende, people in present-day Sierra Leone who was kidnapped, and he was taken on a slave ship, and then they revolted on the slave ship, and then through a whirlwind, a zigzag event trying to get back to the west coast of Africa, they ended up off the coast of Long Island, and then U.S. President John Quincy Adams defended them in front of the Supreme Court. Why don't we know this story? So as a teenager, I was gripped by a story I didn't know from a piece of archival material that came in the form of a graphic novel, of a comic book. And I went on to create a solo performance about Joseph Cinque and the Amistad captives. And after I made that performance, I got a phone call from a woman named Joan Maynard, who introduced herself as the illustrator of the comic book that my parents had given me. And then she went on to become, we ended up adopting each other. She became my adopted godmother. I became her adopted godchild. And I was just struck by, again, that larger story where you see goodness, providence, just guiding your steps because of archival material that connects you to the past in this visceral way. So, yeah.
Well, there's 2, yeah, use those. Well, I have to talk about, before I get to the idea of Carmen de Lavallade, this idea of archiving for me in this process. I've kind of coined a phrase with a good friend of mine, Catherine Profeta, who is a dramaturg and choreographer, works a lot with Ralph Lemon. And we were doing kind of a dog and pony show around dramaturgy and dance. And we both have been talking about sort of our engaged process and practice, and discovered that we had this sort of simpatico, similar idea of dramaturgy as sort of active archiving. This idea that we were constantly, from residency to residency, throughout the process of developing an art piece, always bringing forth history to think about the future, constantly, so that in a way, archive is not an inert or dead thing. It is an active, it's an action word. Dramaturgy, action word. Archiving, to archive, is an action, a way of always sort of bending the past into the way of looking forward. you know? And so that was kind of an engaged practice that we both understood and recognized inside of the way she was working with Ralph Lemon, and at that time, I was working with B.B. Miller. But the real beginning of it, I have to credit a long-term collaborative relationship with Ping Chong in his process called Undesirable Elements. And Undesirable Elements is a community-based oral history sort of theater witnessing in which we go into communities and we interview a number of people. Initially, really it was about otherness and foreignness. So we were looking for people who were bicultural, bilingual, who were bringing a journey here to understand place, how place is made by the people who come and arrive in that place. And we go through interviews and we build sort of this timeline, living archive of history by telling individual stories. And so it was that practice, which was an interview-based practice, a historical practice, kind of a living inside of history, past to present, that really trained me over, I would say, 15 years in really thinking about interview and engagement and living archive. And it was that practice that actually guided Jenny Pickett to invite me, and Anna Glass, to invite me to work with Carmen de Lavalade. So that's my personal way of thinking about archive practice in the generative art making. Yep.
Oh, I love that. And so then from that place, y'all are so brilliant. And I just have to let you know, I've just been like, I'm fangirling in this moment. But I've also just been like immersing myself in just the many representations of your work. So I wanted to, and I'm glad you mentioned Undesirable Elements, because I was going to ask about that. But so then moving from that, you do also both talk about the archive in relationship to trauma, in relationship to who's excluded from the narrative, but also what's missing from the archive, right? In your process of creating performance. And I love that you both have the impulse. Like you said, you're in high school and you're like, what should I do with this history? Yes, a performance, like that was the place you went. But also that there's something, I feel that there's something implicitly there and sometimes explicitly expressed around healing, around trauma, around what does it mean to do this work of embodiment. So in terms of that work with Carmen, with Queen Carmen, let me say, who we all revere, and also in terms of the work that you're doing with At Buffalo, and especially the use of music to try to speak and embody those things that are excluded from the archive for certain reasons. I'm just interested for what those relationships are and how you've seen, how you have responded to what can sometimes be the traumatic impact of what is recorded in the archive in terms of a traumatic history, what's excluded and the trauma of that exclusion, but also the work that you're doing in terms of embodiment, in terms of dance, in terms of music, to make something else possible.
That's so good. Oh, that's such a good question. And there are a lot of layers to unpack, because all of us, when we engage archival material or engage the archive, we all encounter what's there and what's not, right? Just thinking about archives and how they come to be. It's what was found, what was discovered, what was not thrown away. So they already are an incomplete picture of life. But can we ever have a complete picture of a past life? That's not what archives are, for me, what they're trying to do. So if anything, I think to be true to the archive is to highlight the things that are missing. Is to highlight the archive, the completeness of the archive is its incompleteness, basically. So this project, At Buffalo, a new musical, which I am thrilled to share with all of you tomorrow when you all come tomorrow, and I see you in the audience tomorrow, is a project that seeks to tell the story of the 1901 Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York, a World's Fair that's not well known, except for it was the unfortunate site of the assassination of U.S. President McKinley. But there are these other stories that have never seen the light of day that have gripped us because the archive briefly mentions it. So it's the flickers that the archive presented that became the, wait a minute, what's that? I'm trying to grab, wait. You said what? Wait, there were former slaves that like reenacted their slave life and were picking cotton? Wait, what? I want to catch that. What's that? The archival material was essentially speaks and sings to us in these very visceral ways from my creative team, which includes Khalil Sullivan, our lead composer based in the Bay Area, co-writer, wonderful playwright, Joshua Williams. When we encounter the archival material or encounter these scenes, we find that our performance practices help to complete the incompleteness of the archive. Music does so much more than all of us can really unpack. Music goes farther than, in a different way than when I write on my page or when I do nothing. It's just, there's something about performance forms that activate the archive, activate the past, that allows us to better make sense of the flickers. And when you talk about trauma, trauma is essentially about flickers that the mind cannot process. So Bessel van der Kolk says, the body keeps the score when it comes to traumatic memory. The body keeps the score because the mind can't process that traumatic event. And there's so many Freudian kind of explanations around that. And likewise, Kathy Carruth talks about trauma is a thing that is incomprehensible, that can only be heard in the wound that cries out, basically. She says that phrase, the wound that cries out. And when we were looking at, especially this attraction called Old Plantation, which has 150 former Southern African, former slaves, former enslaved people, African Americans reenacting scenes of slavery. For us, there's no better site to grapple with trauma and archival trauma than this one site of a minstrel kind of reenactment, recreation space. Because the question is, how and why would a former slave and former enslaved person want to reenact every day, day in out, any aspect of their past? And that's where traumatic literature gives us some clues. Like Judith Herman says, it's an event that can be fully assimilated only through repetition. And performance practices, if the body keeps the score, then our question is, for us to access that story, can our bodies become proxies for that trauma? Because we're becoming proxies for the archive. When we take on reenacting the reenactments, what do our bodies learn about those experiences? What do our bodies learn and can insert into the incompleteness of that archive? So that's why I think performance is at its key for us, key for me, in better understanding archival material is to get it into the body.
There was this point, I guess, about 10 years ago when I came up with this idea that I said, well, the most radical act for me to do in the 21st century is to be a part of unleashing the repressed and suppressed history of the 20th century. And that the idea is most of these things that we do not know them because they have been suppressed, repressed, often through violence and sort of governmental intentional purpose to suppress a history. So the point for me was to really start thinking about how I could make theater sort of rooted in this historical past. And one of the first projects that I worked on was a piece called Greenwood is Burning, which was about the Tulsa, Oklahoma race riots of 1921. And I developed that as a devised piece with a group of students at the Duke Ellington School of the Arts. And it was this profound experience for them and this idea of history, because most of the time they were like, did this really happen? Is this true? Why don't we know about these particular events? And the process of embodiment, since it's a devised piece and they're discovering it, it was at a time when there was an incredible amount of scholarship and oral history that was sort of being done around sort of reparations and really thinking about that particular event. So we really were embodying and evoking these voices and these witnesses and thinking of that as an impactful experience for us to relive and to witness, to hear direct source material, to hear some of the most vicious, racist fomenting coming from the editor of the newspaper, just using it, just speaking it, putting it out into the air. You know, it's shocking to all of us today that here is an editor of a major newspaper espousing some of the worst racist. I think you get the picture, you know. So I guess, you know, I'm just sort of tapping into these particular places where I've engaged in thinking about history in which we were really using source material, sort of interviews, sort of what is there to kind of enliven and inspire us today, you know. So I'll talk about Carmen down the line.
Okay. You see, I keep asking. I think that that's so brilliant, and sometimes it really is in the creation of art that we realize what are the archives of our desire. You know, like what are those memories that we need. I'm thinking about a film process that I was honored to be part of. Writer and director of the film, Shango Dare, is in the building. But the film When We Free explores the first camp meeting after emancipation in the Carolinas, and Shango Dare led through the Black feminist film process, this process of character development as ancestral remembrance. And as folks did the work of character development of like, okay, here's this person, you know, what does she do when she's nervous? Can she swim or not swim? You know, what are the details about this character beyond even what they enact in the film? What we realized in the room was like, oh, the flatness of these people were enslaved being the only thing that we know about people that we're claiming as ancestors, you know, and what about the fact that we could have just kept going deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper actually also taught us about the dehumanization and the historical theft that had occurred, and at the same time provided a way to say, but you know what, we actually, it is right and revolutionary for us to want that archive, to want that specificity, and to want deep relationship with the unrelatable, you know, like what's been made historically unrelatable. And I see what both of you are doing in your work as something that takes so many approaches. I mean, again, through the music, I'm thinking also of Kaleidoscope, you know, like thinking about an alien perspective and thinking about a futuristic perspective of looking at what does it mean to relate across everything, across time, across difference, but also across exclusion from a definition of the human. Yeah, so if y'all could talk about maybe specifically, you know, some of those songs that have come out, and especially the cross-diasporic conversation that is happening at Buffalo, and also the work that, I mean, anything that you want to talk about obviously is exciting, but I am thinking about that work in Kaleidoscope and what it means to create a space where, as Toni Morrison would say, right, the unspeakable things can be spoken.
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about Kaleidoscope, because when I was looking at your website and sort of the process that you were going through at Buffalo, it's exactly the same process that we're going through in this piece called Kaleidoscope's Adventures in Pre- and Post-Racial America. And it is a continuation of my collaboration with Ping Chong. And we started it as a commission, which was in response to the Trayvon Martin killing. And it was a commission by the University of Maryland at the Clarice Smith Performing Arts Center. And the goal was to engage with students and with graduate designers in a particular exploration. And as we started doing the research and thinking about this was happening while the trial was still going on, and we realized immediately that there wasn't really much that we could add to that particular story as it was unfolding at the time. But we wanted to understand sort of the history around it. And it led me to begin to think about stop and frisk, the stand your ground laws, the echoes of Jim Crow, going back to the Black Codes. And that really took us on this particular journey of time and history in which we basically started thinking about the history of violence against the Black body, particularly in America. And of course, because it's a Ping Chong lens, he's going to view it, because how do we sort of inhabit that experience for a full audience and let everyone have an objective view and think about this history. So he came up with the brilliant idea of thinking of this intergalactic time traveler who can't quite understand race and violence, or they don't quite know why, and they're sort of investigating us as a sort of a species, and they have a way of traveling through time. So sort of the time device is really an archive. So we actually are building the stories through newspaper clippings, trial testimonies, found stories, confessionals that really travel from the founding of this country to present day. So it's built as if the alien is it's very arbitrarily flashing through time, and then it's almost like a holodeck. We do these reenactments. And we really use a diverse group of students everywhere we go. We've created 3 so far, University of Maryland, UMass Amherst, and Wake Forest. And we've come at times when those campuses have been engaged with, particularly at UMass, there were a whole series of newly racialized incidences that were happening on that campus at that time. So it was really a part of an engagement to have a comment on the history of racialized violence and riots on that campus in particular. So everywhere we go, we kind of curate new scenes that we add from the community itself. So we're constantly, again, feeding sort of this history of place. We discovered a wonderful story, Angeline Palmer, sort of who was an abductee, and Emily Dickinson's father was the trial lawyer, and this all happened in Amherst, Massachusetts. And basically, she was, it's a free state. She was not a slave, but she was an indentured servant. But the house where she was working, they had just gone into bankruptcy. So to try to find a way to get themselves out of debt, they were going to sell Angeline into slavery, and use that money in order to save their estate. And this is an actual case and story and trial and for Amherst, Massachusetts. So that was one of the news stories that we collected and reenacted inside of this exploration. So it's active archive. It's engaged with history. It's active embodiment. And inside of that, it's also trying to understand what does it take to play these roles and these characters? How do we understand it as a group? How do we investigate these ideas? So for me, it's an example of all of the things that we're talking about, sort of this active living archive and embodiment of history. Yeah.
Boy, I'm thinking a lot about things that you just said, Talvin. I forgot the original question. Remind me, diaspora, because I'm just like riffing on this. So good. I want to hear more about this. I'm like,
I don't actually remember myself at this point.
It's
We were
so
just
good
transported.
because as you were talking, I just kept coming back to, why archive? Why the archive? Why do we keep coming back to it? Why do we want to activate it? Why? What is that connection for all of us? What draws us to it? Especially as performers, as creators, as artists, and it just feels such like a natural fit that I often am surprised at how much further we have to go in terms of getting artists and archivists and these spaces and places together in the same spot. Because as you were talking, I'm like, yes, this makes sense. The archival material, you found something new, and that makes you create something new, and it's this beautiful symbiotic relationship between the arts and the archive, AR, that all begins with the same. That I know I'm preaching to the choir. I'm just processing it aloud for me, because to hear your process, Talvin, and how similar our paths have been. And we're working in 2 different spaces, and yet, as artists, our engagement with the archive and our need to tell these stories and to bring it forward, like so many other colleagues, is quite palpable. So I'm just responding to that.
Could you just add a little bit about, because part what's built into the structure of At Buffalo is that invitation for the archive to continue to expand. Can you talk a little bit about that? So brilliant.
Yes. So last night we had this great dinner. And I'm still formulating, these thoughts, but I see our archives completely linked to technology in the sense that, you know, the moment a new discovery happens, boom, the technology's old, and it just shifts our entire understanding of our world today. The same thing happens with the archive. Irving Velati said it. He was like, entire arguments, presuppositions come from what we find in the archive. I'm not quoting verbatim. So this idea that lurking in your grandmama's trunk in her attic might be the very thing we've been missing of, you name something that we all are hoping to find. I don't know. What's something that we wish we knew that we don't know?
The cure for racism.
Yeah, the cure for racism, yes. The recipe to cure racism. You know, and so this idea that archival discovery always keeps things new is something that at Buffalo has to navigate. So in our libretto, we are intentionally putting the archive on the page, footnoted, endnoted. We make artists have to see it on their own terms so that they have to interpret it anew each time. Now, theater makers, they do that anyway with scripts, but we have another layer by making them confront the archival material for themselves and to do the same kind of historical work that a historian does, but from an artistic lens. And we have to keep things open. Open in the sense of, what if somebody does find an answer to a question that our show has? You know, a fundamental question that we have is, how did Africans and African Americans think of each other when they encountered themselves through these crazy attractions you'll learn about tomorrow? What did they really think? Well, the archive doesn't have that. And so right now, our performance practice is a part of that solution of showing multiple perspectives and possibilities of exchange that human beings could have, knowing historical context at that time. But what if you, in your garage right now, have this amazing letter written by W.E.B. Du Bois, who we still don't even know if he came to the 1901 Buffalo, New York World's Fair when his own exhibit was there? What if we find in your cousin's trash bag, you know, a recording of a film clip that showed Africans and African Americans encountering each other at this fair, and all of a sudden you have the answer. That means the script has to stay living, has to stay alive. Much like we're talking about a living archive as part of Dan's dramaturgy, the script has to keep that possibility of discovery open so that a revision can happen. Newsflash, Josh and Khalil, that's the next task that we have to do in our revision process. You know, because that's the archive. That's what it looks like to engage on an archival journey, is to allow yourself to be open to discoveries.
I just want to claim something that we did say, that maybe we can boldly say that the cure to racism is inside of the archive. Because much of what we're talking about, I mean, I see it when the audiences experience Kaleidoscope, the ability to have conversation around this history, to kind of understand it. Not that it solves anything necessarily, but it does begin to open up the possibility for conversations that were not happening or could not happen prior to that. So I think what we're talking about, that there is a part of the solution, at least in this idea of engagement with the historical archive, to release these stories and to enable us to have this other reflection, because we live in this reductive notion of what history is, and we really don't know our own history and truth. And so therefore, this idea and this engagement allows us to face it and have a conversation with everyone in the room. So.
Okay, we're gonna take this on the road. It's called archive is a verb, racism, we coming for you. I love it. So I had two more questions. Like that, yes it is. It is there, and we're awakening it. I had two more questions. I think I'm gonna try to combine them into one. So we've talked about engaging the archive through performance. We've talked about the performance itself as an embodied archive. I wanted to ask, because I know this is a concern for both of you, about the question of archiving performance and performance institutions and performance practices. And I'm trying to then combine that with critiques that you have, suggestions that you have about how archives operate in the contemporary moment, and what you would change about those in accountability to this project of ending racism, this project of honoring resilience, but also looking at those gaps and at those traumas. So it is kind of looking at, so if archive is a verb, how do we archive, and how should we archive, and how is that different from how archiving exists in our contemporary moment?
I think one of the things, and that really relates to me in a very direct and personal way. I guess about 8 years ago, I started this project called Testament, 40 years of Black theater history in the making. It's now potentially 50 years, because it's taking me a while to do it. But yeah, exactly. And the whole point, it was a very personal sort of need and desire, and it was a recognition of a moment in time and a place that I think I actually could carry. And a lot of it had to do with right out of undergrad, I entered into a phenomenal theater company called Crossroads Theater Company, which was a Black regional theater company in New Brunswick, New Jersey. And when I got there, they were just 8 years old. And but the season that I worked with them was the season that they premiered George C. Wolfe's Colored Museum. And so it sort of really launched his career. Then it ultimately went to the public. It put Crossroads Theater on the map. And then suddenly I discovered that I was at the right place at the right time. And in that institution, I met Mongeni Ngema. I, of course, met George. I met Woody King. I met Dr. Bob Ryan Tier. It really was just this wonderful sort of historical generational moment for me, because I was suddenly meeting my elders and future mentors and sort of representing a particular point as this young artist. And this is in 1986 when that happens. But I discovered something about my place in this trajectory in sort of meeting the previous generation of pioneers, this current generation of theater makers, and this future idea of where the Black theater institution was evolving or going. And I felt that the information did not live in the way that I wanted it to live. And this is in 2007. So I had been teaching a course on sort of Black theater history in the making, and wanted to start a project in which I was looking at 3 generations of theater makers, sort of the first generation pioneers out of the Black arts movement in the 60s, and sort of really understanding that as a signature moment in sort of in this trajectory of thinking about Black theater institution. There's a subsequent generation, I call them the second generational regionals, and there's this proliferation, Penumbra is one of them, of Black theater institutions that come up through CETA funds in sort of late 70s, 1978 into the early 80s. And then I wanted to look at a new generation of Black theater makers. At that time, organizations that were 10 years younger. I was at Congo Square, they're now almost 20 years old, so time is moving fast. But the important thing for me was I wanted to hear the history in their voices. So I went about, I initially, through a Ford Foundation Fellowship, initially interviewed over 60 practitioners, sort of from multiple generations. That's how I met Jonathan, through a series of panels that we hosted at NYU. So the whole point that I'm getting to is this idea of institutional memory and history that lives inside. We often look at Black theater, we look at plays, we don't always look at how they were produced or how they got produced. And sort of what's the history inside of those institutions that made those choices, then make this history of the plays that we get to see. And what is the role of Black theater institutions inside of that? Because at the time I started working on the play, most of the second generational regional theaters had closed. We were losing them fast. Some of the pioneers were holding on, definitely National Black Theater and Woody King's New Federal. And then there were these interesting new ideas and new ways of thinking of making and producing. But it was important for me to understand that history and how those institutions were wrestling with the traditional regional theater model. Did that work for the African American community? How could these institutions survive? Where do their archives live? Penumbra's is here, all of those great places. And thinking about the history that those institutions hold and carry, just in, the culture wars of America. And so that became the foundation of what I was trying to create with that book, and still trying to create with that book because it's not finished. But I think that's my answer to that particular question. It's this idea that there is institutional memory, there's personal memory that has not been documented. Sort of all of those things in real time now. And sort of my whole pitch was I wanted to get to that generation and those voices. I was able to interview Dr. Barbara Antier before we lost her. You know, so there was a value to that. I mean, literally within 2 months. So that was the important point for me. I wanted to hear from her articulation of the history of where the organization was, how it had survived. I wanted first voice understanding. And so that was the effort in trying, and the effort that I am still trying to achieve with that. So it's a mixture of all of it. Yeah.
Archive as a verb, right? And what might be the responsibilities, the rights and responsibilities around that verb. In one way, I think about Buffalo State, their archive. I just engaged that archive for the first time about 3 weeks ago. And I went in there looking for something else, but then as archival journeys always go, I ended up landing on something else. And curiously enough, what I landed on was sparked by Spike Lee's Bamboozled, that film from 2000, which is a satire about if a modern-day minstrel show were to go on TV today, what would happen. I'm currently writing an article reviewing that right now, and so it's had me also realize that in part why I've been captivated with allowing the archival material to show its face, to be right there for the audience, comes from Spike Lee's film. In that film, how many of you have seen it? So about maybe a third of you have seen it. It's Spike Lee, so there's elements of Spike Lee, but I still think it's one of the best films that tackle representations of blackness and how the archive is the space in which cures for racism, cures for confronting misrepresentations can and should occur, because he makes archival material present throughout. Not only do the characters engage archival material when they have to look at song sheets of minstrel characters, but he has all these black memorabilia, black collectible memorabilias of a jolly inward bank, Aunt Jemima toys, and he ends with archival artifacts in the credits of that film. So when I found myself at Buffalo State a couple of weeks ago, I stumbled into a little-known collection called the Lester Glasner Collection, that similar to the Ferris Museum in Michigan. I want to say Michigan. Forgive me, it's just going out of my head. It has hundreds of these black collectible artifacts, similar to what's shown in Bamboozled. And at that moment, the archivist himself did something I found quite profound, because I was having a very visceral reaction to opening these really offensive games or Aunt Jemima toys, and it's just one after the other. So the archival labor of going into the box and unwrapping the acid-free paper to look at it, and then he held space for me as an archivist in a very interesting way I've never had happen before, where he was providing context as to how this collection came to be. He literally was in the room with a level of support that allowed me to have more strength to keep going deeper into the box. So when I thought about this verb archive, and I think about archivists, who I really see as my superheroes in general, the beauty of the archive and the archivist is that they are the ones that can hold culture and community and society accountable, because they are the caretakers of these past objects. That without that wonderful care and providing access to those artifacts, we will still be walking around traumatized because we don't know about these gaps of our own past, our own history. And so when I think about Umbra Search, I love the idea that it's a digital interface. It's about access. It's an aggregator, as Cecily describes it, of of what already exists in all these various archives under the umbrella of African American history, because African American history is American history. I fundamentally believe that to better understand America is to understand African American history. Umbra search is about access. So for me, that's part of archive. Archive has to be accessible to the people that need it most because they're walking around traumatized, right? And then another part of our journey is that every archival institution has its own set of rules and regulations around permissions, right? Around handling. But permissions especially, there has to be changes for when you have artists coming into to the space of the archive. Because we're not trying to use archival material in what has been a typical format, which might be as illustrations in a book, right? We're not trying to enter a reading room. We're trying to enter, from our perspective, from my perspective, a performance room. Meaning when I come into an archive, I literally need a space where I can sing aloud because the archival material is asking me to sing. If I'm a choreographer, I need a space in which I can move around and feel what the archival material is doing to my body. If I'm a sculptor, I need a space in which the archival material can be there and I'm with my clay. So this idea of archives being open to other uses of archival material, giving it the permission of more than reading while we're with archival material is key. And then because we're artists, and we don't roll in the money like science and technology, is giving discounts on permission fees. It's a very practical thing, but it's real because, that's very real. You know, it's about access. Like I think archive is about access. The artifact helps us access the past. The archive is a space in which we can access that past, and the archivist is the one that can facilitate our access. So, yeah.
Yes. Genius, genius, genius. Okay. So I am going to open it up for your questions and insights. I just want to remind you of what we just collectively witnessed, that this moment also is an opportunity for us to embody those archives that we're carrying differently and to really honor the possibilities that our panelists have told us they're committed to in this space. And so we would love to hear from you if you have questions, if you have insights that you want to share prompted by this discussion. Yes, and I'm going to, I guess, run around with this mic.
Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate this talk. I'm someone I just graduated with my master's in history this May, so
Congratulations.
I know about being in the archives for my thesis research.
Yeah.
I'm a third generation veteran in my family on my maternal side. And my mother was in the Army in the late 70s, early 80s, and she was one of the first women who served in an integrated training unit, gender integrated, men and women after they got rid of the Women's Army Corps. She was the first training unit. And I never really thought about that. It really didn't mean anything to me until I was done with my military service and went to graduate school and studied women who served in the Army during the Vietnam War. And when I did my research, I noticed that we don't exist in the archives. Women, African American women who served in the military really doesn't exist in the archives. Very few things have been wrote on us, so I didn't have anything to work with besides Ebony and Jet magazines, who might have published an article about a woman who did something great in the military, or very few interviews that was compiled by some person who was interested in a certain war, but that person was not Black. And with that, it's kind of troubling. So I really understand the importance of archives, knowing that I did not have the support of archives. And when you don't have that, then you lose voices. And when you lose voices, it becomes very dangerous, especially for marginalized groups like Black female veterans, because when you look at military service, it's usually seen as a white male space, and only their issues are addressed. So when you go to the VA as an African American woman, your concerns are not taken serious. You don't get the support you need in that space because to them you don't exist. When they see a Black person, they don't see a veteran. And when they don't see a veteran, they don't look at you as someone who needs to be helped. So by not having those voices to represent us, we don't have what we need within our own community. I really appreciate the work you're doing by bringing forth voices that wasn't heard.
Likewise, with your work. Wow.
Does anybody else have a question or insight? Shandodari is going to generously pass you the microphone.
Thank you.
It's not really a question, it's a story. It's inspired by what you've been saying, and this came from my husband's family, that my father-in-law, who lives on the campsite that he went, they have a summer house on the campsite that he went to from the time he was 7, and it discovered a box of photos that someone nearby had buried. And it was a box of photos archiving Jewish presence in the day camps. And the woman who had buried them has passed away. So this box exists, and the story was kind of about the box, but it was also it became about what was buried in that box. I realize now is not just the photos, but an accounting of a particular kind of culture of the early 20th century, around both the kind of fear of spread of urban disease and the segregation of Jews before they were white. So it's a buried history of whiteness and of Jewishness and of that kind of separation that had to be reintegrated. So I'm thinking about that, and I'm thinking about a book I'm reading by Elizabeth Son on Korean comfort women in quotes, and she talks about embodied redressing, and it makes me think of reparations and this idea of what we need to do to the recipe for eliminating racism is in the archive. It's about reparations. It's about that work of repair and redressing, and what Son talks about is that redressing a wound, that figuration is important because it's what you can't just, when you redress a wound to heal it, you can't just put a Band-Aid on it to conceal it. You have to keep unwrapping and rewrapping. You have to keep paying attention to that wound. And that's just kind of what I'm stimulated to think about in terms of this idea of the archive as the recipe for addressing racism. But I want to know more for myself about how do we keep redressing that wound? How do we keep working towards reparation in this country?
No, and I want to respond to that, Sonia. I have a very good friend who is superintendent of schools in Kalamazoo, and one of the things that he is addressing, and I think it acknowledges this, and he says, there is incredible scholarship available. The information is available, but it is not entering the literature that we're teaching our students have access to. So we actually are in this kind of gap void of the information is here, out there, waiting for it to be sort of engaged and can be a part of this particular process. But his feeling is it's slow moving inside of our textbooks and the things that students have access to. So it's this act of archiving and engagement and access, and then what are the methods and the vehicles, and how that has to be, I think, a radical effort in really bringing the information to the people who need it most. And I think it's all about these stories, and how do we continue to build that as an action as well.
And at Buffalo, we realized that the archival material showed Buffalo, this beautiful city, to be an allegory for the American experience. And And we're really grappling with that in our revisions right now, in this way that we are convicted that if we can just get people to see the archive, just get people to see what they were saying over 100 years ago, and they sound exactly like us, we will start to wake up more when it comes to race relations. And so that space of the archive being a place where healing can happen, we feel it right now with this material. Now, we do have a question. Sometimes we kind of confront too. Well, gosh, it sounds exactly like our present day moment. So why do we keep repeating it? And we still come back to it's because people just don't know the archive. They just don't know this material. And if they could just see it on their own terms, somebody, somewhere, all of us will find some solutions now, because it's just been way too long. Yeah.
So I guess I'm curious to hear if either of you have worked with community organizers and activists to prepare theater specifically for education for decision makers or other people. I've found, like in my work, I've done a couple of timelines as a way to give some race class analysis, but I feel like sometimes it can get stuck. Like a timeline is seen as like this training thing that you bring people through, and it can feel kind of stuck. And I've been thinking like, oh, wouldn't it be amazing if we could partner with a theater group that could enact some of these things and just make it come alive in a different way. And so I'm wondering if either of you have done that sort of thing for those purposes. I mean, I guess you have in a broader audience, but specifically for a training for, I'm also a planner, an urban planner, and so I remember seeing the at the History Theater the play of the Highwaymen, and just amazing, and how a lot of people know that was an incident that happened and it was a thing, but they didn't, it's like it was described earlier, that's like two-dimensional. And then you come into the play and you see like, wow, the white labor union folks were destroying people's homes in the middle of the night, and then the city came in and said, oh, it looks like we'll put some citations, so then you have to leave, so they could displace them quicker, and just so many different complexities. So anyways, I wanted to hear a little bit if either of you have had experience with doing it for that sort of purpose, maybe.
Josh and Khalil, if they were here, they would say, we are the activists. They are definitely the activists as part of our team. And but yes, the short answer is yes. Even right now, we're in Buffalo for 5 months. I'm there for 5 months continuously, and then the team joins me at a later point so we can do this intense development process with our professional actors from New York, with local Buffalo actors, as well as university students. And we are in collaboration with every single archival institution that we use material from whom we use material in the libretto, as well as local community organizations and theaters. And we're still following up with the city of Buffalo as well, because to tell the story of a World's Fair, we discovered we need to follow this World's Fair approach, which is get everybody a part of the process. And so that's what the process demanded, and that's what we're doing. So yes, I think that was
Yeah, and I have to acknowledge that the Kaleidoscope 2.0, which was at UMass Amherst, was part of a 2-year project called Art, Community, and Legacy, which was established by Judy Abalali and Priscilla Page. And it was sort of 2 years of community engagement. All of it was planning to sort of arrive when the Black alumni were having their kind of annual event. So it was a celebration. Really, it was a tribute to the protests and activism that had happened during the 60s. And the group behind Art, Legacy, and Community felt like the current student population didn't really know about that particular history. And they were dealing with these issues, and they had presented a list of 21 demands to the university and did not know that in sort of 1967, a similar list was also presented. So we created an event inside of the piece in which you heard the language from 68 and you heard the language from 2015. And it was a whole discovery for them of, I mean, it was almost, at least of 21 points, 10 points exactly. Police sensitivity, sort of training, you know, all of those things, the exact same language was used. So the whole idea was trying to use this piece as a way to engage student activism and also to teach them, well, not teach, I wouldn't say that, help them to understand that they're part of a lineage and that there was a history sort of at that time. So the answer is yes, especially, hopefully, always.
Oh yeah, I just had a question, and I came late, so if this is like, oh my God, we talked about that for like half an hour before you got here. But I guess what I'm really interested in and excited about what you do, is just the ways that it almost seems like, oh, this is a new way to engage with the archive, is, you know, pulling it into performance and like figuring out ways to utilize this content to really sort of speak in conversation with people and performance. But I'm also interested in just kind of like maybe more ancestral arc for engaging stories and histories of peoples that often, you know, can get buried if there's not particular people who do have a certain kind of nuance with holding on to stories and being curious about people's stories in a way. So I just kind of wonder, like, just in embarking in this kind of work, which, I mean, in a lot of ways, in having worked with archives in the limited way I have, it is kind of like, oh yeah, like to me, the way I kind of think of it is like, oh yeah, you go into a space, you pull out these books, or you pull out these things, and you look at it. But also, like, what are the ways to really be like, no, like, there's been ways that we've interacted with our history and the ways that we exist in the world that don't have to do with just being in an institution, but really living and embodying the work that predates maybe even our remembering of it. So I'm just curious as to how maybe you've seen this work in that sort of lineage.
I was going to ask you to talk about it.
Great. Yeah. So I would say I'm going to come at your question from a side angle, because what I hear in it is, you know, even the approach that we're taking to making theater, period. What kind of lineage exists for that? And it's I know for my own theater making, my own worldview, it's a very Afrocentric space, meaning it's about community, it's about everyone's a part of the storytelling, it's about we all are in a circle. It is about knowing that when I say archive, I not only mean that building or the space that has the material, I mean any place where I can access the past. It's me being cognizant of things are still held in gesture, is still held in orality, and recognizing that there is a fraught history anyway with the archive for people of African descent worldwide. Because even in Ghana archives, you know, national archives, they don't have the cooling systems that are here. So papers are literally crumbling, and it's hotter, right? And it's more humid. So, you know, this idea of even what the relationship should be to the archive for the African diaspora, especially on the continent of Africa, I already feel a tension, in addition to all of the colonial problems of archiving and collecting and theft around those histories, and a devaluing of orature and so forth. So, you know, when I hear your question, I'm thinking about, well, why, like, the need to go about telling this story in a communal sense of not trying to be the only auteur of it, but recognizing, no, to tell this story means I'm not going to be the only one engaging with this material. Everybody else will too, and they'll be a part of the process, so we can all tell this story together. I think comes from actually a cultural space, maybe a Ghanaian space specifically, and I haven't been able to name it, but for me, that's where I feel there's other lineage. In addition to even in theater, there's already documentary theater. There's already these strands that have been called, that have formal names that are similar to the kind of work that we're doing, that also are about excavating voices. So Anna Deavere Smith's work, right, immediately comes to mind, that there's already folks that have been doing this. But that process of devising and working in fellowship with others to tell it comes from another space.
And the shirt is speaking, so I also have to acknowledge that the whole foundation and fundamental practice of National Black Theater through Dr. Barbara Antier was to build rituals of understanding, accessing history, and performing it for community. So yes, it's grounded in it's embedded inside of this institution since 1968 and before. So, not new, but that idea of ritual and community rituals that allow people to come and see themselves and to see their history and to learn of their history is really what that institution was founded upon. I know you're happy, Jonathan. So.
Look that we keep talking to the archival document.
I know.
Yeah, and we're like, for the record. So I'm going to say what I thought you were going to say. So, because I was thinking about Du Bois himself, right, who did create this exhibit for the World's Fair that I learned about from you, but also thinking about the fact that he was working on Encyclopedia Africana with your godmother at the same time that he was creating performative pageants for the community. Like that those things have been together. And then I also was thinking about, and am always thinking about, Ida B. Wells and the work that she was doing, right, to create these records and these gaps in the narrative, and to at the same time be creating spaces for young people to engage with that history. And then I'm thinking about Harriet Tubman, and thinking about in terms of the Combahee River raid, that work that she did to say, okay, I don't actually know how to really speak Gullah very well, but we really have to all get off these plantations right now because it's, we're burning them down and we're flooding the rice fields and you all have to get onto these boats. So that she used song, right? And she was like, what are the songs and what are the stories that we know together through song that help us with the archive of what we don't know how to communicate with each other? That archive of song that you also are referring back to by creating those songs and responding with music to the archive. So I do think that connection is there, and I'm so grateful that you brought that into the space also. I don't know how many more questions we have time for. So the one more question is in Zile.
First down, thank you guys, all of y'all, for this remarkable conversation. It's really incredible. But I wanted to ask you all, so we live in this kind of state of deathly repetition, right? We live almost, kind of feels a little nightmarish. And when we talk about the archive, there's always this way in which, it's come up in the conversation, in which we are seeing just how much past struggles are kind of reenacting themselves today. And so in many cases, we kind of trace this repetition in certain ways. I think, Alexis, you were a little bit different kind of engagement. But anyways, I'm playing hooky from prepping for class for tomorrow, but I'm going to read this quote by, what's his name? Jose Esteban Munoz, and it just came to mind. He says, hope is spawned of a critical investment in utopia, profoundly resistant to the temporal logic of a broken down present. Now, this book came out, I think, in 2009, but we're still in the broken down present. But I was wondering if any of the creative activity of looking and going to the archive to understand the history of a place and its people, African American culture, et cetera, is built upon this idea of, I hate to say it, hope and alternatives to the repetition of the broken down present.
Process it, think about it. No, I mean,
You're saying if? Was there an if?
How have we looked at the archive, like thinking about African American history how can we think about African American history and culture and even Blackness in such a way that isn't organized around this temporal logic of deathly repetition? Meaning, Black death always is kind of repeating itself, the tragedies that we have. I mean, I'm at the point now where it's like, this is what we live in today. But are there alternative ways of reading and engaging with the archive that look for these kinds of utopias or kind of reparative hermeneutics that were resistant in the present? Not unlike what, with Alexis when she was talking about, these songs and how we're going to escape these translations, et cetera. Is that like a generative part of thinking about Black theater life in terms of like your current projects in histories of place and Blackness? So this kind of what the question is.
I think the one thing that I will say, and it does frame a little bit in Hope, is the idea of the continuous engagement that actually will embed itself inside of the cultural memory, so that we're actually embracing sort of the information as we move forward. So it's not a perpetual rediscovering, but it's now hopefully that the more informed we become, the more we learn and grow, the more we make change, so that it wants to have this, I feel that that's what I feel I'm committed to, that this is not just something I want that's new and then forgotten. I want it to be embedded into the ongoing new cultural memory, so that it moves something forward as opposed to being sort of this empty void or sort of vacuum. So in some ways, yes, I'm embedded in this idea of hope that this does happen and will continue to happen.
But one, it resists kind of the linear progress narrative, like it was then, so even the idea of forward movement, like outside of those spatial temporal logics of propulsion.
I get it, but I also just have to acknowledge my own limited understanding of the effort and activity that I think I'm engaged in. I hope that it is moving in all these different dimensions and directions, but it is the forward moving act that actually propels me to make the commitment. That's in my maybe two-dimensional way of seeing it, but yeah, those are my human limits.
I'm going to process your question, and I want to talk more with you about it afterwards. So I want to make sure I understand the layers that you're presenting. But riffing off of Talvin, it's a similar thing for me, like hope is a propulsion underneath it. Maya Angelou says, when you know better, you'll do better, right? You hope with a thinking mind, right? So my investment in the archive is because I want to know better. I want to do better. And I believe that when folks engage the archive on their own terms, they'll know better and they'll do better. Very simple, but complex because we're human beings. And I do think that archives are present to help us repair where there are gaps, even in its incompleteness, but at least gaps in cultural memory, gaps in social memory. Because when we were dealing with unequal understandings of the past, I think that's why the deathly repetition keeps coming. So, maybe, I don't know if it's reductive to say that that's where the hope is or not in engaging archival material, but I certainly have a lot of hope and a lot of love in doing it, because I think that's part of love, that you see people are in error, you correct it in love. And archival labor is an act of love to America. It's a gift to America, for America to engage itself from its past that it's trying to hide away. When you have these caretakers of archivists who are like, hey, we have it in 50-degree weather, you just got to come and get it. So
The important thing is that the archive isn't new history, it is the history. And what we're living in is the delusion of that we think we know the history. So it's that's what I'm saying about the releasing and unleashing of this is the history. And what we're living inside of is the denial or the rejection of what is there, what happened. confronted.
We might have different interpretations of it.
But at least see the thing. At least say the thing is here. At least we can all say, I got something in my hand. All right, let's talk about the thing in my hand. That's the beauty of archives for me. Yeah.
Well, I just want to acknowledge both of you for the incredible work that you do, the bravery that you bring, showing up again and again to confront what most people in the world are avoiding, and to open up your bodies to that space, and then to hold space for whole collectives of people to be with that complexity and to be with that possibility and to be with those challenges. It's a miracle. It's a miracle across time. It is a blessing that can never be undone or taken away. And I'm just so grateful to you all for continuing to do it in those moments where people weren't acknowledging you for it, or when it felt difficult, that you continue to say yes to that work is a blessing to all of us in this room, all of us not in this room, way beyond the live stream, into the future and far into the past. We are grateful for you. And I'm grateful also to everybody who showed up to be in this space with such open hearts, with generosity, with your pocket archives and everything that you carried with you, and the generous listening and sharing that you offered in this space. This is incredible, and it does give me an embodied memory of what it means to be in the present differently because of how we were present here. So thank you so much.
And I just want to say thank you so much. And thank you, Alexis, for being such a serious and generous facilitator of this conversation. Really what the three of you have been talking about is at the core of the work that we've been trying to do with Umbra Search. And you've articulated so much that we can't, and I have so many more questions that I want to ask you, but I will refrain. Thank you all for coming. I want to let you know, if you don't, that the Archives and Special Collections here at the University of Minnesota Libraries are sponsoring our first artisan residency program. We have a call for proposals that closes on October 15th at 10 p.m. It's a Sunday night. So please, if you're interested, Google Ask Artist in Residence. You'll find it. It's a Google site. Share it with your friends. But this is a space where you should be able to look at something and sing, and you should be able to look at something and move. And there's so much that artists can do with this material that I don't think other people can do. So thank you so much. Thank you.
Be able to sing and move and